The other day, I was having breakfast for dinner at Cracker Barrel, which, is like the best thing ever. And when I was there in their little walk through the gift shop kind of deal, I saw that they had this really large planter that was a skull. And it was the coolest thing ever, except it wasn't as cool as this one that I made. Thank you very much. It was also really expensive. So I decided to try my hand at making my own, and I recorded the process in case you want to join me and do it yourself because it's really a lot of fun. But what you're going to need, first of all, is some coffee. Yeah, make sure you get that. And then a plastic planter, and then some evil thoughts to make your skull planter. So I've got a plastic planter, a big bin to mix up something called celluclay. So celluclay can be found at local craft stores, usually not in this quantity. I just happen to have a bunch. And a little goes a long way. I don't know what the direction sheet said. I just kind of tossed that aside because I'm like an old pro at this. By the way, don't do this near your coffee. First thing you're going to want to do is just put a whole bunch in a plastic container that you don't plan on using again. So maybe cut off a plastic jug or something like that, or a big plastic bowl like I have. You'll want to break up the clumps of the celluclay before you add water, and then add your water. And now you see why I say do it outside, because it's super duper dusty stuff. And you'll want to knead it until it's not super sticky to your hand. You want it to have basically like a clay kind of consistency. And like I said, a little goes a long way. So make some, and then you can dive in and get started. So once I had my celluclay made, then I was ready to start covering my plastic container. I've worked with celluclay and covering things in plastic quite a bit. And the cool thing is that celluclay will stick to the plastic. You don't have to roughen the surface. You don't have to do anything to get it to adhere. It will literally just stick. I was kind of rolling a golf ball size piece of celluclay, smashing it, and then just kind of pressing it onto the surface. And you see it sticks no problem. A lot of times if you were using regular kiln fire clay and you draped it over something, as it dries, it shrinks and it would crack. That doesn't happen with celluclay. There's no cracking. It's just great stuff. And here's something else that I absolutely love about it. You don't have to work on it all in one sitting. You can work on it a little bit, let it dry, come back. The dry celluclay will accept the wet celluclay. It's very accepting. And you don't have to worry about keeping it wrapped or damp or anything like that. In fact, if you do, it would probably mold. And here I just wanted to provide you with a little bit of a close-up so you can see how I'm working. I didn't mind that my hands were leaving an indentation. I thought that it added a cool texture. Speaking of texture, it does dry very rough to the touch. If you don't like that, once it's completely dry, you could take some fine grit sandpaper, and again, doing this outside, sand it down to make it a little bit smoother. I've seen a lot of people that I follow on social media that are kind of like interior design hacks, and they love to make things for their home that have that concrete look that's really expensive in retail stores, but you can make it with celluclay. So now that dried, I took a little bit of a break. It didn't necessarily have to dry before I moved on to the next step. I was working on the skull. So the first thing I did was I created kind of like a bridge at the top for the eye sockets. And I'm going to apologize. I had no idea that my Gigantor head was in the way for the majority of this like very important portion of the video, whatever. After I created the eye sockets, I made these totally exaggerated nostrils. So the thing is, I know it's a little bit goofy and wonky looking, but the more exaggerated I thought, the more spooky it could look. So that's why I started adding even more clay around the eye sockets to really build that up. But you don't want to get too carried away, because at one point I did bump it and the whole thing just kind of tipped over on its face because it was getting really heavy with all that celluclay on the side of the face. So don't get too carried away, because I'm going to show you some effects that you can do with the paint that will also make it look really dimensional. So this is the part when I hopped on Instagram and I was like, guys, what's happening here? What am I doing? What's happening? What's going on with these teeth? After I created the little indentations of the gums, I started adding little teeth to hang off of the edges. And again, I worked on this in waves, in parts. It dried for a little while. I came back and worked on it again. Totally fine. But if you do have a lot of leftover celluclay that you're not going to get a chance to use, go ahead and wrap that really well in plastic wrap and keep it in your refrigerator. It'll keep for, I don't know, maybe a week, then you can just bust it out and work on it again. I'm telling you, the stuff is amazing. So now I added a tiny little chin, and let me tell you why, because it kept falling forward. It kept leaning forward. So I had to have the chin there to kind of prevent it from tipping forward on itself. Once the teeth were added, it was pretty well finished. I am so tempted to add giant eyeballs, like one eyeball in the socket and one hanging out. I maybe will make a second planter, maybe a little bit smaller. I'm dying to do the eyeball thing. Somebody needs to talk me out of it. Anyway, so I'm just adding more here. Again, trying to really accentuate and exaggerate the cheekbones, the jawbones, and the teeth. Now that it's dry, I decided to go ahead and paint. This is a couple of days later. I really wanted it to be thoroughly dry before painting. That's important because if the celluclay gets wet again, I had a feeling it would start to disintegrate on the plastic container. I mixed up a really I don't want to say really dark gray. It was kind of a middle of the road kind of gray. And I just covered the whole thing. Remember I said I'm going to share with you how to create more dimension? This is how you do it. You do lots of layers of paint. So the base coat on the whole thing was just this kind of like a gray color. And then I mixed up an even darker color, and that went in the eye sockets, and then an even darker color still. So just kind of layering those different colors, sometimes using a really moppy wet brush, and then other times a dry brush. Then I mixed up kind of a creamy white color. It had a little bit of a yellowish tone, and that's what I used for one layer of the light. And now you can see it's really starting to look like there's a lot of depth. I even hit it with some splatter paint before going back with a dry brush and going over the whole thing with a little bit of white. Super excited with how it looks. I did drill some holes in the bottom of the plastic containers for drainage. And then I had my plant Francis decided to go, actually, that's Peanut. That's, don't ask. That's Peanut. And I think it makes the perfect hair for this planter. I love it. I love the process. And I just wanted to share. Toodles.